Welcome to the first advanced government lecture of the year on political parties. It's going to be a long one, so let's get started. First off, what purpose do political parties serve? Three big ones. Labeling. First of all, imagine walking into the election booth on November 6th. You might know who you want to vote for president, for Congress, for Supreme Court, but when it comes to a lot of these other offices like state Supreme Court justice, town alderman, county legislature, maybe even New York State Assembly, you have no clue who to vote for. This is where political parties come in. By having a little R or D next to their name as the voter, that helps you to identify that person with a certain set of political principles, which you also might agree with, and therefore makes your job as a voter that much easier. Organizations. Political parties have kind of waned as organizations in the latter part of the 20th century. But political parties used to be so important in terms of gathering support, raising money, getting the vote out, sending things in the mail, making phone calls, putting up lawn signs. Many of these things political parties still do, but parties have kind of taken a back seat to some other institutions, which we'll talk about when we talk about elections and campaigns. But nevertheless, parties are important as organizations at the local, state, and national levels. And finally, leadership. So as a party chairperson, you might exercise some influence over the president, over Congress, over members of the state assembly or the governor potentially. So the elected officials might look to you for guidance, or party leaders might try to push legislation to be introduced. Of course, it's the legislators who have to do that, but they certainly might advocate for that. So today we consider, Barack Obama would be even though he's not the Democratic National Committee chair, he's considered the leader of his political party. And currently at the moment, Mitt Romney is the leader of the Republican Party. Now, if we're to compare the American party system to Europe, you will see some fundamental differences, and this certainly helps to explain some potential reasons for our partisan bickering and potential dysfunction within our political system. The biggest thing to note, and keep this in mind, American parties are weak compared to Europe. So Europe has a very party-centered system where the party wields a heck of a lot of power over governing. In America, it's very candidate or individual-centered. So let's break down some of these differences. In Europe, you do not get elected unless you have the backing of the party, which means the party chairman is the one who's picking the individuals who will run in certain offices. In America, we know that's not the case. We don't have a party boss like we used to in the 19th century. In fact, it's the voters who choose the candidates, not the party bosses, through the primary elections. That's an important reform that comes in the early 20th century and is a game changer for the power that political parties exercise. Next, in Europe, people vote on a national level for parties. So if I'm living in England and I go to the polls, I'm not voting for Tony Blair or Gordon Brown for prime minister. I'm actually voting for a party. I'm voting for the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. By putting that party in power, I'm giving the party boss the power to pick and choose certain people to fill the seats of parliament and therefore ultimately fill the prime minister's seat as well. Contrast that with in America, where we don't vote for the Republican or Democratic Party boss, we vote for individual candidates for individual offices. In Europe, because they have a unitary political system, there is only one party. So the Labour Party in England is the Labour Party of England. However, in America, because of our federal system, we have multiple levels of parties. So you might have a Republican National Party, you might have a New York State Republican Party, and you might have a Erie County Republican Party. Now, all these parties might not have the same goals. They might not have the same objectives, but that's a consequence of our federal system. So less lock, stock, the parties are less in lockstep than they are in Europe. In Europe, parties actually get to select the chief executive. So the prime minister is chosen by the members of the legislature, voted on, with, of course, the party boss exercising an incredible amount of influence. In America, the president is independently elected. Well, this is going to weaken the power of the party to pick and choose his subordinates. So you might have a president who is surrounded by certainly a Congress who might hate him, but also, people within his cabinet might be people who the party doesn't necessarily like. because more power is given to the individual candidate to make the decisions. And then final difference, in Europe, parties are very much social institutions. They might host a wide array of social events, whereas in America, they typically are limited to the political realm. You might see, a local pig roast or a lobster dinner, something to raise money for the party, but not to the extent that you see in Europe. So in Europe, hypothetically, the Labour Party might sponsor, bowling leagues for working class Britons, or an assortment of other events. And this used to be the case once upon a time in America, but political parties used to be, if you think back to Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed, they used to provide actually welfare services to immigrants. So that's more of a European tradition and something that American political parties do not really do. Now, if we're to take a short look at the history of America's party system, and we'll look at this in class tomorrow, but think about how the Founding Fathers viewed parties. So there was a very big skepticism or fear of what the political parties could do to the country. And you see this in Thomas Jefferson's quote, and just to really quickly summarize, Jefferson has the famous quote, "If I could not go to heaven but with a party, I would not go there at all," which is, of course, very ironic because he was an incredibly partisan man in his duelings with Alexander Hamilton. And we'll look more at this in class. Now, to take a quick trip down memory lane and to breeze through kind of how have the political parties evolved in U.S. history, because certainly we have Democrats and Republicans today, but we know that wasn't always the case. And to be a Democrat today was not what it meant to be a Democrat, certainly pre-Civil War. So let's kind of take a look at how these political parties have evolved. So the first party system refers to the Democrat, Republicans, and the Federalists. So these parties were very localized. They were not national. So the organizations were focused on maybe a state level or local level. The geographic breakdown tended to be Federalists were found mainly in the Northeast, and the South and West, more agricultural regions, went with the Democrat Republicans. There wasn't a clear class breakdown, so it's not like these parties necessarily catered to the rich or the poor, the middle class or working class. The big divide between these parties was the power of the federal government in foreign policy. So these parties are seen as kind of an outgrowth of the ratification debates with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, one being in favor of an activist federal government, the other being in favor of a limited federal government. And certainly the French Revolution is a very polarizing event in world history that divides the parties as well. The second party system will be created after the death of the Federalist Party, which comes after the War of 1812 as the nation enters the era of good feelings. So the Republican Party is the sole party, yet geographic differences remain. So certainly, New England with its manufacturing, and the South with its agricultural economy, and the growing West with its desire to see internal improvements. Different regions have different economic priorities. And as a result, the Republican Party splits into multiple factions. So by 1832, you see a new round of parties emerge. The Democratic Party, which is Andrew Jackson's going to be a big founder of, and they're going to champion the Jeffersonian ideals of a limited federal government, and the Whig Party, which is pretty much a rebirth of the Federalist Party, in favor of a more activist government. As a departure from the first party system, you see both parties kind of appeal on a national level rather than a local level to the people, the common people, and promote the language of democracy. So you see this is an era of incredible party building, of political parties becoming organizations and using those organizations to certainly rally the masses to get involved in the political process. Now, the second party system, you can see here the death of the Federalist Party in 1820, with the country being unified, and yet by 1840, both the Democrats and Whigs, who are both national parties, you can see these aren't sectional parties or local parties. You see the Democrats taking states in the North, South, and West, and the Whigs doing the same. Now, the second party system will die with the Mexican-American War. That's going to be the catalyst, of course, that's going to propel the country towards the Civil War as the slave issue becomes a matter of national debate and concern. So the Whigs, due to the slavery issue and what to do with this new territory, are going to disintegrate into numerous factions. So the Know Nothing Party takes a more anti-immigrant approach. The Liberty Party is very much abolish slavery right now, and the Free Soil Party, which is committed to the containment of slavery. Now, by the late 1850s, these numerous factions will reunite under the banner of a brand new third party called the Republican Party, which obviously continues on to this day. The Democrats remained a viable party, but they end up splitting in 1860 with a Northern Democratic candidate and a Southern Democratic candidate. After the war, they will reunify, but that division, that tension with the party will always remain. And parties, therefore, will remain sectional in the aftermath of the Civil War until the 20th century. So the Republican Party will dominate the North, and the Democratic Party will dominate the South, so much so that the southern states become referred to as the Solid South because of their consistent voting record for the Democratic Party, which, of course, becomes the party of white supremacy in the aftermath of the Civil War. And you can see here the transition from the Whigs and the Democrats, both national parties, to sectionalism, with the Republican Party being very prominent in the North and the Democrats in the South. Now, as the third party system continues into the latter part of the 19th century, as these parties become more sectional, they grow stronger within these given sections. Now, this is going to lead to divisions within the parties. So, case in point, the Republican Party is going to splinter into two factions known as the Stalwarts and the Mugwumps. Very funny names. Now, who are these groups? Well, pretty much you have different party bosses or people within the party, competing for influence and competing for control. And one big way that you do that is you promise supporters favors, or in particular, you promise them jobs, known as patronage. So if my political party, if I come into power, if I control that wing of the party, I'm going to promise you a job. So certainly there's a motivation or incentive for people to join that organization. Now, this is the era of Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed, who builds an incredibly effective party machine in New York City. Tammany Hall drawing on the support of Irish immigrants. And, you don't get elected in New York City without Boss Tweed's approval. So it becomes very much a democratically controlled city, thanks in large part to the creation of this party boss figure. Now, this will all come to an end, of course, with the Progressive era and men like Thomas Nast, who are going to go after Boss Tweed and champion, instead of the party bosses, the primary election, which is going to be coming in the early 20th century. Now the fourth party system. And now this is going to start to get a little weird, because up till now, every time we have a new party system, we have a new political party. But that's going to stop. And instead, when we have a party system from this point forward, what you'll notice is that it's not the Republicans or the Democrats changing, it's who supports the Democrats or Republicans that is changing. So case in point, in the election of 1896, many Democrats flee their party and become Republicans because of the populist influence. They think that the Democratic Party is too agrarian, it's too backwards, it's too allied with the South and the West. And a lot of middle-class Americans see the Republican Party as the party of business, the party of industrialization, the party of moral reform. And what's going to happen after Republican victory in 1896, this is William McKinley's victory, you're going to see the Republican Party dominate for the next 30 years. So between 1896 and 1932, there will only be one Democrat elected, Woodrow Wilson, and really the only reason he's elected is because the Republican Party splits into the Republican camp and the Bull Moose Party led by Theodore Roosevelt. Now, it is during this time period that the seeds of the death of the party system are sown when the primary election is introduced in the early 1900s. And you can see the transition here. So the parties, for the most part, are very sectional, but you can see in the bottom map where the Republicans are expanding, not just in the industrial Northeast, but also into the West, which is significant. So the Republican Party during this, this fourth party system is enlarging its base beyond just, business. Now, this Republican dominance is going to come to an end with the Great Depression. So in 1932, the Democratic Party will come to power for roughly a period of about 30 years. And this comes about when FDR creates his New Deal coalition. So the North, for the first time ever since the Civil War, begins to lean Democratic. So the sectionalism of the parties has ended officially. African Americans will leave the Republican Party, who they credit with freeing them from slavery, the party of Lincoln, and they will join the Democratic Party, viewing Roosevelt as very progressive-minded on race relations. Industrial workers who in 1896 might have voted for William McKinley, in 1932 instead vote for the Democratic candidate, Franklin Roosevelt. And the Democrats will officially transition from a Jeffersonian vision of a limited government to a more Hamiltonian vision of an activist federal government. And, much of the Democratic politics today can be traced back to this fifth party system and Roosevelt's influence on this party. And you can see in this map the sheer dominance that the Democratic Party will have in the decades to come post-1932. And, tracing this to today, there's some political scientists that speculate that we are entering a period of the sixth party system. And when this happened, it was during the 60s and 70s. So there was constant tension. As blacks entered the Democratic Party, this made the Dixiecrats, white segregationists, incredibly uncomfortable. So which way does the Democratic Party go? It cannot serve two masters here. Well, a lot of white Southerners, with the election of Richard Nixon and him using race as a political tactic with his Southern strategy, these white Southerners bolt the Democratic Party for the Republican Party. And the Democratic Party becomes the party of civil rights. The Republican Party, doesn't exactly champion civil rights, but, we'll go along with it. But a lot of white Southerners flee to that party because they don't want to be allied with African Americans in the Democratic Party. Now, what this means is the Solid South, which had once been Democratic after the Civil War, is now Republican. So, to this day, I think we can almost say that the South is still the Solid South, although Barack Obama made some inroads in 2008. And, of course, what will this produce? This is going to produce the Republican Revolution. So, well up till 2008, you see Republican dominance of politics, that the country goes from left of center, where it was during the New Deal and the Great Society, to right of center with the Reagan Revolution. Certainly Bill Clinton, even though he was a Democrat, governed very much as a moderate Democrat. And there is an argument to be made that Barack Obama has done the exact same. And you could see in these two maps then the transition. So the South goes from being, in 1968, the South for the first time begins to become Republican instead of Democrat. And then if we think about, where we are today with 2008, the 2008, what do we make of it? Was this the death of the sixth party system and the potential creation of the seventh party system? Probably too early to tell. But I think when we look back on it 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, we will say that the election of 2008 was not a critical or realigning election. Nice transition, Mr. Bell. So what is a critical or a realigning election? Well, we've been talking about them for the past 10 minutes. So every time you have a new party system and they've come to power, it's the result of a critical or a realigning election. So a couple different definitions. So it's a new issue that arises at a given time, and what it causes a massive shift in the political party systems. So it could be that you see a new party emerge, like in 1860 we saw the Republican Party. It could mean that the parties change a long-held stance. So for instance, the Democratic Party embracing civil rights. Or it could be the idea that coalitions that had supported the given parties switched their support. So case in point, African Americans in 1932 bolt the Republican Party and vote for Roosevelt and his New Deal coalition. So 1828, 1860, 1896, 1932, potentially 1968 are all critical or realigning election. Now what's interesting, political scientists have noted, is that this occurs every 30 to 40 years in American politics, which makes political scientists wonder, can we predict it? Can we see what the future may hold? Is it a pattern, or is it just a coincidence that these things happen? So that's a question really without an answer. Now, even though we talk about the parties throughout history changing, one thing that is constant throughout American history is the existence of only two parties. Shocking statistic, America is one of only 15 countries in the world to have a two-party system. That certainly doesn't put us in the majority. Now, why is that? Really perplexing question. Well, let's take a look at Europe again. In Europe, and not just Great Britain, but many European countries, you have a system called proportional representation. And this is how their elections are run. So if there are 500 seats in Parliament, and think about Congress, we have 435, so relatively equivalent. Remember, in Parliament, in a parliamentary system, people vote for the parties. They don't choose the individual candidate. So how this works, the Democratic Unionists, if they win 10% of the vote nationwide, not a state election, not a local election, a nationwide election, these are unitary political systems, they will get 10% of the seats in Parliament, which is 50 seats. Now you're probably wondering, who chooses who sits in those seats? Think about that. Answer, the party bosses, the party leadership does. So this is certainly a system that gives the political party a significant amount of power. But as a result, because you do not need 51% of the vote to win an election, this promotes the rise of multiple parties. So in America, you need 51%, which is known as the plurality system. Now, there is something to be said for this. So, you can win 10% of the votes and have an influence. But if you look at these numbers, no one party has a majority. Well, how do you govern then? Coalition building. So in Europe, what you'll see often is the Liberal Democrats might win the most, we'll use the Conservative Party here. The Conservative Party might win the most votes nationwide, but they don't have enough of a coalition to pass legislation. They still need a majority vote to pass legislation. So the Conservative Party might team up with the Labour Party, and they might share power. Therefore, they both are going to have, a say and an influence over any legislation that comes before Parliament. So this is called coalition building, and it is something that certainly exists in Europe, but not the United States. So let's talk about the United States. Like I said, America operates under what's called the plurality system, also known as the winner-take-all system. So if you don't win 51% of the vote in an election, you lose. This makes it very difficult for third parties to get any traction. So, Ralph Nader got 5% of the vote. Very few third parties have ever held congressional or even senatorial office, let alone the presidency. And it's because of the plurality system. Sometime if you're, really bored, just check how many registered independents serve in Congress. I bet you can count them on two hands. Even in the Electoral College, which is also a winner-take-all, even though it's at the state level, you still need 51% of the vote. Some third-party candidates do win states. George Wallace, for instance, in 1968, wins part of the South with his segregationist platform, but they're not able to win the presidency. So you have never had a third party burst onto the scene and win the presidency, in large part thanks to the plurality system. So do third parties even matter, or are they just the third wheel of American politics? Well, there's only been one minor party that introduced in 1854 that became a major party, and that's the Republicans. So within 6 years, they established themselves as a major party. That's the exception rather than the rule. Mostly, the way that third parties have an influence is by influencing the two major parties, pulling them either to the right or to the left, focusing their attention on certain issues. So let's take a look at a couple examples. 1896, the Populist Party. This forced the Democrats to stop ignoring the concerns of rural America. As a result, a lot of Democrats, big business Democrats, bolted the party for the Republican Party. In 1912, Teddy Roosevelt champions the Bull Moose Party. He acted as a spoiler. So TR was championing a more progressive platform for what he viewed as too conservative of a Republican Party. And this led to the Democratic victory. So we see this on a couple of different occasions where a third party could enter the race and take enough votes away from one of the two major parties to cause the other party to win. Same thing happened in 1992. Ross Perot's Reform Party. It forced Democrats and Republicans both to consider Ross Perot's ideas. And what ended up happening is George H.W. Bush probably would have gotten a lot of Ross Perot's votes had Ross Perot not been in the race, and as a result, Bill Clinton won. 2000, Ralph Nader's Green Party. Al Gore, he might be trying to pass an amendment to alter the Electoral College. He really should just pass an amendment to, get rid of Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader siphoned enough votes away from Gore to act as a spoiler, especially in that state of Florida. And then in 2012, what do we see? Do we see a third party? Certainly there was talk that the Tea Party might actually become a third party. But I think if we look at what's happened, the Tea Party has exercised influence from the inside by dragging the Republican Party further to the right. Now, to just quickly discuss different types of third parties that there are, a couple different categories. We could break it down into ideological parties. So these are parties that are they have a radically different vision of government than the major parties. So the Socialist Party, Green Party, Libertarian Party. These are parties that will be lucky to get 1% of the vote on a national scale. So typically they don't have much of an influence on the Democrat or the Republican parties. Then you have one-issue parties. So these have been common throughout U.S. history and even today. The Free Soil Party, committed to containment of the West. Know Nothing was an anti-immigrant party. And the Pro-Life Party, which still exists today. So they champion a particular issue that they feel the Republicans or the Democrats might be ignoring. And then factional parties. So these are probably the most important in terms of having an influence. So the Bull Moose Party, very upset with the course of the Republican Party and their approach towards big business. The Dixiecrats, so a faction of Democrats devoted to white supremacy and segregation. And the Reform Party, which ended up kind of splitting both major parties, but certainly hurt the Republicans more than the Democrats. Now in class one, we'll read an article, questioning whether our two-party system works and potentially, seeing would America be better off adopting a proportional system and having more third parties. But this is a really excellent article, and I would encourage you to read it very closely. Lots of very interesting information that'll help explain the political system that we currently have. So to just give you a short, little view of what the author might say in that article, does our two-party system work, or is it broken? A lot of observers say we're locked in an era of bitter partisanship, that the system is broken. And the causes of this are a rise in split-ticket voting. So what is split-ticket voting? Split-ticket voting is where you have a person goes into the the voting machine, and they pick a president of one party, but for Congress they vote for a different party. So what this causes is divided government. So you're putting, two different parties in power, and nothing, if you look at the current system, right, nothing gets done. The Republicans took back the House in 2010 and pretty much stalled any legislation that President Obama was looking to pass. And we will read something on divided government versus unified government, which refers to a single party having control of both the president and Congress, and debate the merits of both systems later in the week. Now, the cause of split ticket voting, of people picking a party of a candidate of one party and a candidate of another for Congress, the cause of that is de-alignment. So de-alignment is the number of people who identify themselves as Republicans and Democrats has sharply fallen over the last 2 to 3 decades. And it's seen by political scientists as evidence of a broken party system. Now, what has caused this to happen? Well, first of all, parties have lost strength. So there's a number of reasons for this. But a lot of the parties have been split into different factions. So evangelicals and the right have pushed out moderate Republicans. Working class Democrats are beginning to vote for Republicans because of social issues. So there is no, strong party leadership that can corral all these different factions and appease all these different factions under one umbrella. So it's very, very difficult. If this was Europe, you would have the Republican Party would be split in 3. So to try to bring all 3 groups into this big tent is going to mean that the party bosses have to compromise on a lot of fronts, and that's going to weaken them as leaders. Another cause is lower political efficacy, and political efficacy just refers to the kind of people's almost political self-esteem. So do people in government care about my opinion? Do I feel like my voice matters in government? And you see a lot of disillusionment. So as a result, people don't bother registering, or they don't bother choosing a political party. Also, people are better educated. So once upon a time, right, we talked about political parties as a source of labeling. They label candidates. Well, today people are better educated. They don't rely on their parties for their information and their guidance. because of the proliferation of the news media and the internet, people can get this information independently. They don't need the party newspaper to pass that information down. And then finally, people are protected from economic hardship by the safety net, Social Security and Medicare, which both parties protect. So there's no economic incentive necessarily in a lot of cases to vote for a given party. Now, this used to be a lot of immigrants would vote consistently Democrat because they viewed the Democratic Party and the party boss, guys like Boss Tweed, as helping them economically, that the Democratic Party would provide specific services. So this is debatable. I think certainly in 2012, you hear a lot of different dialogue about the safety net and dependency on government. And whether or not economic partisanship might be making a comeback is a legitimate question to talk about. But people typically don't vote as if Medicare or Social Security are going away, which is why 2012 is such an interesting election. Another point the political scientists raise is that de-alignment could be an indication that the parties are more similar than different, which I think a lot of people who follow politics closely, who are very partisan, would be shocked to hear that they don't notice the difference between Republicans and Democrats. And that's, I think, an idea worth talking about in class. So with that, we will end this lecture. Come to class with your notes prepared for a quiz. And in future days, we will take up some supplemental readings to dig deeper into these concepts and have some hopefully good discussions on the American party system, whether it's broken or not, whether we should potentially reform it. So with that, good night and good luck.